After 1945, the international community organized around a specific premise. If the world could reach overwhelming consensus on a moral issue, coordinated executive action would naturally follow. The data tells a different story. Since the inception of the United Nations, global mandates have faced a persistent structural failure in execution. During the 1956 Suez Crisis, overwhelming international demands for withdrawal occurred simultaneously with physical invasions. Later that same year in Hungary, formal condemnation of foreign intervention did nothing toward halting the tanks entering civilian infrastructure. Through the 1960s and beyond, the fight against apartheid generated strong global opposition, yet enforcement mechanisms moved at an incredibly slow pace. By 1992 in Bosnia, deep humanitarian and legal concern resulted in critically delayed protection, leaving armored vehicles standing idle while civilians remained exposed. These events demonstrate a recurring structural behavior. Global consensus is statistically decoupled from global action. History is littered with global moral mandates that inevitably end in local paralysis. Systemic failure is a feature of modern geopolitics, embedded in the architecture of the system itself. That exact disconnect remains active today. Despite unprecedented levels of global communication, resolutions condemning conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza consistently pass, while the conflicts themselves continue. We measure global moral signals through the UN General Assembly. When a voting board lights up with overwhelming majorities, the institution accurately reflects human consensus. But that consensus is non-binding. The capacity to enforce those decisions resides in the Security Council, where power is constrained by vetoes from competing states. To understand why this happens, we can analyze the United Nations using a biological framework, a brain attempting to operate without a body. As a cognitive system, the UN functions highly effectively. It gathers inputs, processes international norms, and consistently determines what is legally and morally correct. However, it entirely lacks the coordinated executive system necessary to physically enforce those cognitive decisions. The system was designed to agree on moral reality, but intentionally handicapped from acting upon it. This creates a permanently decoupled institution. We can move from observing this historical gap to strictly quantifying it. We measure this gap using the Deviation Index. The formula is D equals V times 1 minus A. In this model, V represents voting consensus, scaled from 0 to 1. A represents action alignment, also 0 to 1. A high voting consensus combined with a low action alignment drives the resulting deviation upward. When we plot decades of UN data, we find a historical mean deviation score of roughly 0.63. That 0.63 is critical. It indicates the gap between agreement and action is not an occasional accident. It is a constant systemic baseline. To explain the forces driving this baseline up or down, we use the BKM Global Strain Deviation Model. The numerators, conflict intensity, represented by S, and power interference, represented by P, act as multipliers. When strain and power asymmetry are high, they multiply the overall deviation. The denominators oppose them: institutional integration, legal enforceability, and humanitarian compliance, I, L, and H, reduce deviation. As these structural pillars strengthen, the overall gap shrinks. The paralysis of global governance is mathematically predictable. The output is strictly determined by the balance of power asymmetry versus institutional strength. This raises a central question. Are we moving in a straight line towards chaos or towards perfect order? This is a timeline line graph tracking the deviation index over 80 years, divided into specific geopolitical eras. It shows that global order is cyclical. During the Cold War, from roughly 1960 to 1990, the graph peaks high into the 0.60 to 0.75 range. This was a bipolar era defined by intense veto competition. That mathematical deviation was grounded in physical reality. Global power was strictly divided into two competing blocks. Following that period, we see a sharp drop in deviation between 1990 and 2005. This unipolar era provided a rare moment of temporary alignment and functional execution. That alignment was disrupted by the 2003 Iraq War. A dominant power overrode the global voting consensus, imposing physical action without authorization. Looking at the data from 2020 onward, the transition back to a multipolar, fragmented system is actively driving the deviation index back up to historical highs. Global order does not follow a straight line of progress. Systemic deviation perfectly maps to the shifting structures of global power. We can shift our lens from the mathematics of states to the psychology of the human populations living within this system. We have to ask how entire societies culturally process existing under a constant baseline deviation of 0.63. To analyze this, researchers use the concept of structural equivalence. This looks at how different systems, from biological brains to international organizations, behave when their cognitive signaling is decoupled from their physical executive. High systemic deviation functions exactly like prolonged cognitive dissonance. It builds immense kinetic pressure over time that inevitably demands a release valve. Across history, societies experience this exact gap, where justice is known but remains unrealized, and interpret it as an intolerable cosmic or systemic imbalance. When a system repeatedly generates high moral coherence but fails to execute, human cultures view it as a broken phase awaiting a massive correction. This cultural demand for a systemic correction manifests through the restoration archetype. When the deviation index sits at 0.63, the statistical reality is that justice is known but not realized. In a human population, this misalignment between moral unity and physical execution is felt as a profound imbalance. Because humans cannot tolerate prolonged structural imbalance, we develop cultural narratives to resolve the tension. Ancient traditions coded this phase of decline and corruption as a state awaiting a restorer, such as the Jewish Messiah, the Islamic Mahdi, or the Buddhist Maitreya. Secular modernity simply replaces the religious restorer figure with the ideal of flawless global governance and perfect human rights enforcement. This brings us to a final unified principle. Restoration pressure equals deviation multiplied by strain. When both deviation and strain are simultaneously high, the expectation for radical systemic change reaches critical mass. The world is not collapsing. Humanity operates in a dynamic, oscillating imbalance. We generate measurable geopolitical tension that cultures continually attempt to resolve, persistently demanding an alignment between what is known to be just and what is actually done.